I'm going to start today by giving you guys a math puzzle. How many of you like math? Some of you like math. All right, let's see if we can figure this one out. This is scriptural math. I want you to see if you can figure out what does severe trial plus overflowing joy plus extreme poverty, what does all that equal? I want you to think of it in terms of what would it equal for you if that was your circumstances, or if it's been your circumstances in the past, what has it equaled? For me, when I look at that, I'm thinking, okay, severe trial, that's not good. Plus overflowing joy, that's good. Plus extreme poverty, that's not good. What does it all end up being? See, I want to take the, I don't want to, but when I'm in those circumstances, overflowing joy probably gets out of the equation for me. So what do you end up with, though, when you got those three things together? I'm giving you a minute to go. You can talk amongst yourself, or you can write down your answers. Somebody said you better trust God. Okay, let me ask you another thing. What do you think the scriptural answer is? And Paul's hitting on one of them, but what is this equation? This Paul, not the Paul in the scriptures. But I am going to talk about Paul in the scriptures in just a second here. We're going to be reading today in 2 Corinthians chapters 7 through 9. And while you're getting there, I want to just remind you that we're in a sermon series on the spiritual disciplines. And we've also had a year-long theme built around the idea of becoming or building a ministry of encouragement and becoming a more encouraging group of people, building a church culture that is encouraging. So this sermon today is actually going to relate to both of those themes. So I've entitled this sermon, Encouragement plus Spiritual Disciplines, You Do the Math. And as I said, we're going to be in the book of 2 Corinthians, and one of the primary themes of this book is encouragement. In chapter 7, where we're going to start today of 2 Corinthians, the word for encouragement or encourage may be translated, depending on what translation you have, as either comfort or encouragement. It depends on your translation. And it is found 7 times in this one chapter in the book of 2 Corinthians. Now that's almost a third of the usage of this word is in this one chapter of this book. Because in this book, the word encouragement, which we know can be comfort, encourage, urge, things like that. It can be translated different ways depending on how the author's using it. But it's used 29 times in the book. And 7 of those times are in this particular chapter. In this book, Paul is telling the church at Corinth that they have been good encouragers. That they have brought a lot of comfort to him and to his co-laborers in the ministry. And they really needed that comfort and encouragement. Chapter 7, verse 5 says that when they went to Macedonia, which is where Paul was writing the letter from, their flesh had no rest. They were afflicted on every side. They had conflicts within and fears without. Macedonia was a geographical region north of Greece, which included many of the cities that we hear about in scriptures, that in Paul's journeys. Cities like Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea. And Acts 16 through 18 tells about Paul's first missionary trip to Macedonia, the one where he's writing this particular letter. He's on a second trip there. But in his first one that is told about in Acts 16 through 18, Paul and his companion Silas were thrown in jail, and they were beaten in the city of Philippi. Then they went to Thessalonica, and a mob attacked the house where they were staying. So they left there, and they went to Berea, and these are just the highlights of the trip. I mean, there was a whole lot of other stuff that went on in ways of persecution. So they left there, and they went to Berea, and things were actually going pretty well in Berea. Until a group of Jews from Thessalonica came over to Berea and started stirring up trouble for Paul there. And it got so bad that he had to flee to Athens in the south of Greece. So we're talking about a place that really had some enemies of the gospel, and a situation in which Paul and his companions really needed to be strengthened and needed to be encouraged by the churches. Paul started out the book of 2 Corinthians by saying that they had been burdened so excessively in the setting of Macedonia that they despaired even of their very life, and they thought they had a death sentence. But that's also the chapter where we have one of Paul's most famous quoted scriptures, where he says, he calls God the God of all comfort. And he says he comforts us in our afflictions so that we will be able to comfort others in the way that he has comforted us. So it was a time of discouragement. It was a time of trouble. He met a lot of opposition in Macedonia, but he also learned a lot about his God of all comfort. There is an interesting, when we're talking about a ministry of encouragement, there's an interesting trickle-down effect to encouragement. Or for the sake of continuing this math theme that I've got going, you could say that encouragement multiplies in its effect. And by this, many people are blessed by one person's act of encouragement. Let's take a look at an example of how that works. 2 Corinthians 7, verses 6 and 7. Let me get there real quick. Why I'm not already there, I don't know. 2 Corinthians 7, verses 6 and 7. Paul says, "But God who comforts the depressed comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted in you. As he reported to us your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more." So we see that God comforts the depressed, and in this case, he does it through a visit by the person of Titus. Someone's physical presence with you in a time of trouble can be very encouraging. And the interesting thing, see, is that Titus, though, had also been encouraged by the church in Corinth. So he was encouraged, and then he went on to go and encourage Paul. So we see that encouragement multiplies. When you encourage someone, they are more capable of encouraging someone else. Let's look at verse 13. "For this reason we have been comforted, and besides our comfort, we rejoiced even much more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all." Encouragement is a powerful thing, and it has multi-layered effects. Have you seen those commercials for the Foundation for a Better Life? And they'll show like one person does something for somebody, like open a door, somebody else is watching, and then later that day they do something nice like clean up a spill, and then somebody sees that, and then they go do something nice, and so on and so on. I thought of that when I was thinking of this principle of the multiplying effect of encouragement. But I'm talking about more than just random acts of kindness. Like I said, we're trying to create a culture in this body of believers, a culture of encouragement. And if you take this challenge to encourage others seriously, hopefully that will rub off on others around here. For example, someone is sick and gets a card from one of you. Then the next time they hear of somebody else being sick and they remember how nice it was to get a card, maybe they'll send out a card. Now, one of the main things that Paul is specifically asking the church at Corinth to do in the way of encouraging is to participate in an offering that he was collecting for the poor in Jerusalem. He was collecting from several of the churches that he had ministered to and founded, and he had even told the Corinthians a year before to start saving for this offering because he wanted it to be abundant. He wanted it to be a real blessing to the poor in Jerusalem. Turn over to chapter 9. I want to read chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. "For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints." He's talking about that offering he wanted to do. "For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them." This is another example of how one group's effort to minister encouragement in the way of a generous offering inspired another church to participate in doing the same. Encouragement multiplies. So let me throw out a challenge to you in the way of a question. Have you approached this ministry of encouragement that we've been talking about for 10 months now? Have you approached it in a way that is encouraging others to be enthusiastic about being encouragers? Have you blessed others in a way that would inspire them to be a blessing to someone else? because they realize how nice it is to be encouraged. Now, I brought up the example of sending out cards. And if you remember back in January and February when I first started this sermon series, this monthly sermon series, I actually brought cards in and I would tell you who was sick or who had death in the family or something like that, and we would do a card shower for them. And I hope that you've continued to do those kind of things on your own when you hear about something going on with somebody in our congregation. When we hear of someone, but I want it to be more than just card showers. We need to encourage one another in various circumstances in life. When you hear about somebody who's struggling with finances, or a broken down car, or someone who's raising children as a single parent, or someone who's been sick and in the hospital, do you actually think about what could I do for them? You know of someone who struggles desperately with depression or other issues in life, addictions, troubled marriages, whatever it is. When you hear those things, do you just think, oh, how sad? Or, oh, I'll pray, I'm not downing prayer. It's awesome. Let's do it. We need to do more than that. Do you actually think, how can I minister to them? When people come to your mind, you need to do something about it. Now, today, how many of you saw me texting during the song service? Anybody? Nobody? Oh, I thought I was going to be in trouble. You did, Danny did. I knew somebody was probably watching me going, Lisa's over there texting. And now I'm not giving you an excuse to text during every service. But what happened was the song that we were singing, somebody came to mind. Somebody who's not here today, and I know what their current struggles are, and I just couldn't get them off my mind. And I kept standing there thinking, I can't be texting during service, What a bad example of the minister, But it just wouldn't go away, and so I had to text her real quick, and I just told her, he is jealous for you. He wants to restore that intimate relationship with you. You said you've been distanced. He doesn't like it either. And so I just reminded her of that. When people come to our minds, we should act on that, and we should do something to encourage them. How many of you would agree that you want a church that would minister to you during such times? How many of us want that? Well, if you want to build this culture of encouragement that I keep talking about, you have to realize your part in creating that culture, in being an encourager, so that others are encouraged to be encouragers. And when you do that, the multiplication effect comes into play. And when enough people are focused on a ministry of encouragement and get a glimpse of how powerful this type of ministry can be, that should come back to you. See, if you're helping to build that culture of encouragement here, then when you are in trouble, it should come back to you. People should be encouraging to you. Chapter 9, verse 6 of 2 Corinthians says that it will come back to you, though, in the measure in which you have given it out. Now, I know that this passage is talking specifically about the monetary gift that Paul is encouraging them to give, and he says it will come back to you in the measure in which you've given it. But it's in keeping with this whole book, and in that chapter as well, to know that that scriptural principle applies to us in many ways. Let's look at chapter 9, verses 6 through 12. Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do just as he has purposed in his heart. That implies intentionality. We have to think, what am I going to give? How am I going to serve? How am I going to encourage? It doesn't just happen random acts of kindness, and that, for us it needs to be intentional. Each one must do as he has purposed in his heart, and not grudgingly or under compulsion. Not just because I'm standing up here saying you all need to do this. You need to do it because it's in your heart to build this kind of culture. Not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. How cheerful are you when you're dropping your money in the offering plate? How cheerful are you when you're sacrificing yourself to help somebody else? How cheerful are you when that one person you've been trying to help so often calls you yet again, and you're saying the same thing to them and they're still not doing it? Do you stay cheerful in that process of encouragement? And God is able to make all grace abound to you when you do this, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. So see, I'm saying it's not just the giving of offerings, it's the deeds that we do towards one another. As it is written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and will increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. So we see that a culture of encouragement results in a multiplication of giving, but also a multiplication of good works and a multiplication of righteousness in our midst. When we're intent about helping each other, I think we're more careful about our lives. I think we're more careful about the way we live. If I'm telling somebody else I'm trying to help them through their struggles, I realize how my life impacts them. So it multiplies spiritual growth. And it even multiplies thanksgiving to God. It brings him more glory. It helps people to focus on him and be thankful for him. Before going on to my next point, let me give you one more challenge in the way of another question, or a couple more questions. What kind of church do you want? What do you want this church to be for you? What ministries would you like to see this church doing to encourage people? And now, what are you willing to give to help these things happen? To multiply the effect of the ministry of this congregation, what are you willing to do? To increase thanksgiving, not only amongst ourselves, but amongst the people who are watching us to see what the church is supposed to be like. What are you willing to do to make that happen? I'm going to go to the next topic, Scott. It's related to this one. Like I said, people are watching us. They're watching us to see if we really believe what we say we believe. Jesus prayed in John 17 that we would be one so that the world would believe our message. And since we're talking about encouragement in terms of math lingo, our becoming one is like saying 1 plus 1 plus 1 and another one and another one and another one and another one until we get through our whole list of people who are in our congregation. All those 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1s equal 1 in God's equation, or it should. And that's obviously very difficult math to pull off, isn't it? And in a technical, earthly sense, it doesn't happen. It's not possible. And sometimes when we look at our relationships, we think it's not possible to be one. But in spiritual math, it is difficult for sure, but it can work. And encouragement is part of the equation for making it work. So we have to build encouragement into our culture. See, by nature, we are prone to be divided, not to be in unity. Division is something we deal with continually because we're all human and we all do goofy things. And this church in Corinth that Paul's writing to was no exception. They were dealing with a member in their congregation who was just outright living in sin, and Paul had written them an earlier letter where he had to be really stern with them. Remember, another interpretation of the word encouragement, which is paraklesis or parakleo in the Greek, can be urge or to strongly exhort. Encouragement can take on kind of a harsh form. We need to kind of correct one another when we see each other veering from the path, and we need to tell each other things that shouldn't be tolerated in our midst. And Paul had written them a letter doing just that and telling them how to deal with this sinful brother. And in chapter 2 of this letter, as well as in chapter 7, Paul acknowledges that he knows that previous letter he sent caused them a whole lot of sorrow. He says, I know it was hard to take. It was just as hard for me to write it as it was for you to receive it, kind of like a parent. This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. But I think Paul really was sorrowful for this thing that made them sorrowful. But he felt like he needed a pretty stern warning to them. But it's interesting that in chapter 2, he says the very people that he made sorrowful were the ones who made him glad. And we're told that they did encourage Titus, and they sent on encouragement to Paul. As the previous messages on encouragement have emphasized, sometimes, encouragement is strong and it is stern. We have to tell each other things we don't want to hear. But if we have built a culture of encouragement, if we have made enough deposits in the encouragement bank, in the comfort bank, in the supporting and the building up bank, then when we need to withdraw from that harsher form of encouragement, we need to say the hard things to one another. If we've built that culture of encouragement, we will know that what's coming from that other person is coming from love and concern. And so encouragement is a key component in this equation for being one. And it's when we're most frustrated with one another that we should focus most on encouragement. I've seen so many times when people are frustrated because the church is not being encouraging enough to them. And yet they withdraw from the church and they're not being encouraging to anyone. I've had people say, I've been gone for weeks and nobody noticed. And I'm like, who are you mad at? Because you haven't been here, so you don't actually know who's here. There could have been somebody missing because they've been sick and you don't even know because you're out there away from them and withdrawing yourself from them. So what are you expecting from a group of believers that you're not uniting with? And what are you doing to help that unity? It's during our times of encouragement we need to be most focused. In our times of discouragement, we need to be most focused on encouraging others and building that relationship in the body that we so seek. And when we do this, not because it's easy, because it certainly isn't. Like I said, it's easier to turn away and to say, forget you, when we're frustrated. But we have to remember that we are called to a higher plane than that. We are called to live together as one for the sake of the gospel. Which brings me to our next point. Scripture talks about the world as a field for harvest. Jesus looked out over the people who were lost in this world and he wept. And he said, look, the fields are ripe for harvest, but my laborers are few. Pray that the Lord of the harvest would send laborers. And what he means there is that we need to get out in the world and start sharing the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ with people. And we need to do it while we're living in good community with one another so that they believe what we tell them. We need to be laborers in the church's ministries so that the church is effective in reaching people and in shepherding those who come. When Jesus looked out over those people and he said they're lost, they're scattered. And he says it's like they're people with no shepherd. You know, we draw people into the church, but sometimes they're just as lost and scattered if we're not shepherding them, if we're not discipling them. And I'll tell you, it's not just me and Scott's job to do that. It's the whole congregation's job. Off on one of my tangents, I'll get back. 2 Corinthians 9 also uses this farming analogy. Paul talks a lot in this passage about sowing seed and harvesting. In the specific context of this offering that's being collected, he asked the Corinthians to give or to sow generously to that offering. Paul says he wants them to give bountifully for that collection. And he says that this offering will greatly minister to the needs of the poor in Jerusalem. So there will be a harvest of thanksgiving because of the generosity of the church. And that thanksgiving will be both from church members and the people who are being ministered to as well as the world that is watching. They will be drawn to the gospel that we preach when we are generous with one another and taking care of one another and encouraging one another. But Paul also talks quite a bit about how the results of the offering go way beyond that. He says that when they sow or give to that offering, they will also reap other benefits. They're going to reap personal benefits like righteousness and spiritual growth and the ability to do even more good deeds. And they are going to benefit and reap a harvest that meets their own physical needs as well. So we see that practicing a ministry of encouragement, which includes giving generously to help each other out when we see a need, increases our harvest in many ways. How many of you would love to have a bountiful harvest in your life? How many of you would love to have more righteousness? How many of you would like to be equipped to do more good works? How many of you would like to have more abundant material blessings in your life, to have financial needs met? How many of you would like others to reap benefits from the things that you sow in the way of encouraging and in the way of giving and ministering to them? Well, we have to remember that reaping the harvest does not come without sowing seed. We've already read that if we sow sparingly, we're going to reap sparingly. And if we sow generously, we will reap generously. So, encouragement requires subtraction as well. We have to give something. We have to pour ourselves out in some way. If we want the adding to our lives, we got to do a little bit of subtracting. We all know that if a farmer wants a good crop, he can't be chintzy with his seed. He's got to get that seed out there and get it out there in abundance if he wants a bountiful crop. And that's just a natural law, in effect. In the same way, there is a spiritual law that to gain something, you have to lose something. And that law comes into place from the very first minute of our relationship with God. Scripture says if you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. You have to give up the whole of your being to God if you want to gain eternal life. And if you want to have a life with God during this time on earth. So it starts there. We have to give up from the beginning. We have to subtract in order to gain. And this is where the spiritual disciplines comes into our equation. Most of the disciplines involve a sacrifice or a giving up of something. You know, we've already studied fasting, a giving up of food. We've studied meditation and prayer and things that we have to give up our time. Things that we have to give up our focus on other things in order to focus on the Lord. To have this ministry of encouragement, you will have to do some sacrificing. You'll have to practice some of the disciplines like frugality, being frugal with your stuff, being good stewards of what God has given you. You're going to have to practice sacrifice. You're going to have to practice simplicity. Maybe you need to tone down some things in your life. Stop having such a full schedule. Stop having so many things that occupy your time and take up maintenance, and you have to worry about how to pay for them and all those things. Maybe you need to simplify so that you can be freed up with your time and your resources to minister to others. You're going to have to practice good stewardship of what God has given you. He has given you what He's given you so that you can go bless other people. Maybe you'll need to do all of these things. Maybe you need to really take an inventory of all that God has given you in the way of your talents and your abilities and your material resources and see, are you being a good steward of those things? Are you offering them back to God and available for His service and available to minister to others? I'm not going to get into each of these spiritual disciplines in detail today. We've been having separate messages on one or two spiritual disciplines. Not going to do that today. I'm just listing them. If you want to know more about them, go start looking online. Or maybe I'll post some things to our Facebook this week. I'm just listing them today to show you that practicing the spiritual disciplines can help you be more capable to encourage and minister to others. And I believe very firmly that we are all more capable than we actually think. Did you know that we can actually give out of our poverty? When Paul is trying to convince the Corinthians to give generously to this offering that he's wanting to take to Jerusalem, he gives them an example of the Macedonians as an inspiration. In chapter 8, Paul describes the Macedonians as people who were in a time of great trial and affliction and in deep poverty. Yet he said they had an abundance of joy. Now right there, they're a good example to us, aren't they? But even more than that, Paul goes on to say that despite their own poverty, they literally begged him, urgently implored him, let us give to this offering to the saints in Jerusalem, to let them contribute to a collection for other people who were poor. For most people, when we're weighed down with our own struggles and everything, that's the last time, the furthest thing from our mind is how can I minister to somebody else? I'm worried about what I need. But the Macedonians begged to give so that they could have the privilege. Scripture says they wanted the privilege in sharing in this service to the saints. They could have made very plausible excuses. If we'd looked at the Macedonians and they said, I'm sorry, I just can't give to that offering. I'm barely making my budget right now. I don't even know where and the list goes on and all of our struggles. If we're talking to somebody like that, I'm telling you honestly, when I'm talking to somebody like that, I'm like, I understand. Scott and I, we stink at asking for money. We're horrible. We need to raise a lot of money to get us in another building, but we just hate it. And, in our congregation, we know people struggle. We don't like to preach about giving. But we're obligated to tell you that if you do, you're going to be blessed. If you sow, you will reap. Listen to this description of the Macedonians and their giving. We're going to look in chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given to the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality, is what the New American Standard says, but if you have an NIV or something else, it might say overflowed in the wealth of their generosity, in their giving. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord. In other words, I didn't even tell them they had to give as much as they did. He says, verse 4, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this not even as we expected. It's like we were surprised. We didn't expect them to give this much. But they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. Talk about subtraction. The Macedonians subtracted so much they were in the negative. Now, I don't really know how each of you has done in all the months since January, since we started challenging you to be more encouraging. I don't know what you've done in response to those messages. But whatever it is that you've done, can you take it a step further today? Can you give it till it hurts a little? When this encouragement emphasis started, I presented a key text from Proverbs 11:24. It says, he that encourages will also himself be encouraged, or he that refreshes others will himself be refreshed. But let's stretch it a little bit further now. We're in month 10 of this. Let's push it just a little bit more. And let's not do our encouraging and our giving and our pouring out of ourselves and our sacrificing and all that because of what we'll get back. Let's do it because it brings thanksgiving to God. Let's do it because it draws people to the kingdom. That text from Proverbs that I've used so often with the series, the verse before it also has this harvest analogy. It says that he who scatters increases, and he who withholds is in want. That's saying the same thing Paul says, is the more we give out, the more we're going to get back. But again, we're not doing it for that purpose. Christ models this kind of self-sacrifice for us. 2 Corinthians 8:9 says, Christ became poor for us so that through his poverty we become riches to the world. Isn't that interesting? And the Macedonians modeled Christ with that kind of sacrificial giving. I heard a saying that I really like. It says, thanksgiving is good, but thanks living is better. 2 Corinthians 8:1-3, the Macedonians gave out of their poverty and beyond of their ability. Some of you may struggle with ability not just in the material sense. Like I said, I know some people struggle with offering. We've had people out of work. We've had people, other issues, and I know the struggles you have financially. But some of us struggle in other ways even beyond finances that we think we can't give to others or be encouragers. Maybe some of us lack compassion. Maybe some of it's just not our spiritual gift. Compassion, mercy, those things. Can you give above and beyond your poverty in that area? Can you push yourself a little bit further? Maybe it's a mental mindset that I've alluded to already. I need to be encouraged. So the last thing I'm thinking about is encouraging others. In fact, I'm mad at them because they're not encouraging me. Can we pull ourselves out of that? Can we get beyond that? Can we give till it hurts? Can we give beyond our ability so that God can multiply the effect of what we're doing? I started out this sermon with a spiritual math problem. We find the answer to that math problem in the example of the Macedonians. I've already read it. 2 Corinthians 8:2 says that out of their most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up rich generosity. Their generosity was even greater than Paul and his companions expected. So that's the answer to our math problem. They gave beyond their ability. Now, we usually, during our takeaway time, which is where we stop, we talk about the sermon. Some people like to go reflect privately. Maybe you want to go journal or do some art to process what God is saying to your heart as a result of this message. We get into conversation groups and do it that way. However you want to process is fine, but we take this time so that we don't walk away from whatever the Lord is doing in our heart as a result of this message. And normally we have questions and stuff like that, things to kind of help your discussion. I don't know. I mean, there were so many different ways I could think of applying this that it would have been a sheet, a page long. And sometimes when we have so many things out there, people sit there going, I don't even know which question to talk about. So I'm not going to do that today. But you need to get before God and see, what does this message mean for you? What would God want you to do as a result of what you've heard today? Do you need to trust God with your finances and give beyond what you think you can give? Do you need to ask His help with an inability to be compassionate or to get your focus off your own situation and minister to others? Is your schedule such that you feel incapable of even giving time to anything anybody asks you to do in the way of ministry? Maybe you need to readjust that. Something that gives you time to be a part of a worthy project. So pray and ask God what the specific application of this message is for you. But I pray that in many ways we will all become more like the Macedonians and beg the Lord for opportunities to serve above and beyond what we even think we could do, for the sake of His name and no matter the cost. And if you don't know Christ or you don't have a relationship with the Lord right now, it starts there. Will you give your life? Will you lose it so that you can gain it? Let's have prayer.